Welcome everyone to this webinar on landslide planning guidance, reducing landslide risks through land use planning. My name is Phil Glassy. I'm an engineer and geologist and a risk reduction scientist with GNS Science based in Dunedin, and I'm going to be your host for this webinar. I'd like to start with a karakia, to acknowledge the ancestors and the people who have gone before, but also to bring us into the space about landslide planning. Mai e te rangi ki te nuku o te whenua, ka puta te ira tangata, e te pō, e te whaio, e te ao, marama, ti hei, moriora. So I hope everybody's willing to engage with this. I'd remind you that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of this seminar slide, and you're welcome to put your questions in there. And with further ado, I'll continue on. The first thing I'd like to say is that the past must inform the future, and there's a Māori saying, kia whakatomori te haere whakamoa, which means I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on my past. And I think we must remember the past and not forget it as we build new cities and towns and new developments. And the picture on the right is an example of this. It looks like a reasonable ground for building, maybe, but 50 years ago, nearly 50 years ago, it looked like this, and it's the Abbotsford landslide in 1979. 60 houses were destroyed, lives of people were affected. And it was one of those events that was the start of a number of initiatives around landslide planning, landslide slope stability, and I think we may have forgotten some of this, and it needs to be reminded. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to acknowledge the support that we've had from various people. We've had a steering group made up of those people there. We've consulted far and wide. It's gone out to district councils and regional councils for consultation. And it was funded by an MB endeavour, and it's been finished off recently. So thank you to all those people that have contributed. It can't be done by just one person. So I'd like to introduce our speakers who are going to take you through the guidelines. Saskia de Vilder is an engineering geologist with 10 years experience in research and consultancy, and she completed her PhD at Durham University on rockfall mechanics before moving to GNS Science, where she concentrated on landslide hazard and risk analysis. And Scott Kelly. Scott is a senior natural hazard planner and the planning and policy team leader at GNS Science. He has more than 8 years experience in resource management, consultancy and research, including 4 years at GNS, focusing on natural hazards. So with further ado, we'll get into the webinar, and Saskia.
Kia ora koutou, thanks for the introduction, Phil. I just wanted to quickly start this webinar by just going through a bit of a structure of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to provide some background for the document, talk about our Landslides 101 for planners, our 5 levels of susceptibility, hazard and risk analysis we're recommending, the planning tools, and then finishing off with some of our case study examples. And me and Scott will be switching throughout. And our real aim is that you come away today with a better aim of the understanding of the purpose and the contents of our planning guidance document. So I thought I'd start off with reiterating, I guess, why do we need this document? And this might be, old news, and you might be well aware of all these statistics, but I thought it was worth restating. So our risk from landslides is substantial, and we've seen that over the past year with all the storms. We know they cost us on average $250 to $300 million. We know that the cost from Cyclone Gabriel is attributed to be $1.5 billion directly to landslides. And from our historic record, we know that landslides have killed more people than all other geohazards combined. We also know from other research that if you spend, for every dollar you spend prior to an event, you can save $4 to $11 post-event. And from areas of also globally high landslide risk, such as Hong Kong, where they've undertaken significant landslide risk management from between 1970 and 2000, they've been able to reduce their landslide risk by about 50%. And we really see land use planning as a tool that can help reduce our risk from landslides. I also want to just sort of talk about, we've touched on the previous slide about some of the tragic consequences of landslides, but I also wanted to point out some of the other consequences. So it's not only, we've also got damage to infrastructure, isolation of communities long after that rain has stopped or the event has occurred, indirect economic consequences. We have the potential for landslide dams to form, drainage disruption, the secondary hazards or ongoing hazards of a landslide dam break flood. And then we also have an example here, which is this animation is showing here, where we can see soil erosion and Tairafiti following Cyclone Gabriel. So you can see the post-event image here with all the landslide scars. And then as we scroll down, we see the pre-event image. So you see how much these kind of events can affect our landscape. And that's essentially pumping sediment into our river systems and changing the river dynamics and fluvial behavior. So who and what is this document for? So our aim was that this document can provide a blueprint and a flexible framework on how we use land use planning as a tool to reduce our risk from landslides. Therefore, it's primarily aimed at planning, policy, and building compliance staff, but obviously can be of use and has implications for geotechnical consultants, developers, and infrastructure asset managers. It provides an update to the 2007 document that Wendy Saunders and Phil Glassy put together. And during that time, we've had legislative changes. We've had significant geohazard events, such as the Canterbury earthquake sequences, and we've had other progress in hazard and risk analysis. So this document is trying to bring all of that in and update it. We were also really conscious that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. And we knew there was the other existing hazard guidance out there, such as the coastal hazard and liquefaction guidance. And we really wanted this guidance to kind of slot into that suite of existing guidance. So we've looked at them in detail and kind of have mimicked the different levels of analysis that are present in those guidance with this guidance. We also know that this isn't a one-stop shop for all kind of hazard guidance. So where we've seen that there's other guidance that might have more information, such as, about community engagement, we've kind of referred out to that guidance. So what's in the document? So the structure of our document looks like this. We've got key messages at the top. We've got 12 key messages. And if you read only one thing, please read the key messages. They're kind of really important things. So if you're recommending this document onto others, just specify that the key messages are the one thing to read. We provide a bit of introduction, legislative context. We have a section that's essentially a landslide 101 for planners to kind of give the background and understanding of our landslide jargon and what planners need to understand about landslides. Then we go through and we talk in detail about the 5 different levels of analysis we're recommending before looking at risk-based planning. And this is really in looking at our talking about risk evaluation. It's got some examples of risk tolerability criteria within it before moving on to looking at planning tools for reducing risk, and then finishing up on examples in practice or case studies from around the country. And so our talk today will loosely follow the structure of this document. So the Landslides 101 chapter, so that's, as I mentioned before, was our way of trying to give planners their understanding of what's the kind of terminology and what you need to think about when you're trying to assess the risk and hazard from landslides. So it gives us information on landslide types, so what's the type of landslides that could occur, Is it a rock fall, a translational slide, a debris flow? And really, because that's important for understanding the impact from those events. So they'll have differences in intensity and velocity, size, run-out characteristics that will all influence their risk. Then it goes through other things. So where could they occur? What's their source region, their susceptibility? Where might on a slope be landslides be susceptible to landslides? How big might they be? Their size? How often do they occur? So their frequency. And landslides follow magnitude frequency principles. So, for example, larger landslides are less likely to occur than smaller landslides. What's their timing? And then this also links to triggers. So, it provides overviews of different types of triggers for landslides. So are they earthquake-induced, rainfall? Is it due to land use change or anthropogenic modification of a slope? Is it coastal erosion? Or is there no obvious trigger? And it also goes through what they might impact. So this is going to look at it from, it's not only the source area of the landslide, but it's also the retrogression and the downslope components. So what do they impact? How far do they travel downslope and what might they impact? So this has got information on debris fans and their characteristics. And then overall, we've also tried to include information on the impact of climate change. All right, and then our next section is really talking about our landslide, the different 5 levels of analysis we're recommending. So we've got these 5 levels. Our main kind of recommended minimum is susceptibility analysis. And what we mean by susceptibility analysis is determining where could be in an area potentially susceptible to landslides. So this both includes the source area and the run out. And that's our minimum. And then it builds on. From that, we move on to hazard analysis, and that starts to incorporate landslide frequency, so the likelihood of an event occurring. And then it moves on to consequence analysis. And so once we start to incorporate the consequences, then we're on to risk. So this moves through 3 different types of risk analysis, starting from semi-quantitative risk analysis. And this is often used in a kind of a risk matrix form. So you might have some information on the quantitative likelihood of a hazard scenario occurring, but you might have qualitative descriptors for the consequences of that hazard. And then you move through to basic quantitative and detailed quantitative risk analysis. And the difference between those two is essentially the number of scenarios that are considered. So a basic quantitative risk analysis might only be considering a few or scenarios, whereas detailed is all your bells and whistles, the whole shebang, fully probabilistic analysis. And hopefully you can see from this diagram on the right that these different levels of analysis kind of build on each other. So you start just to feed in more and more information as you move through these levels of analysis. It's also worth mentioning that our terminology is following the international standards for landslide hazard and risk analysis. So I'm now going to just move on and talk through some of the examples, some of our case study examples. So this is one from Nelson. It's looking at susceptibility analysis. And you can see here they've specified 3 different tiers of susceptibility, as well as areas potentially susceptible to run out. And basically our intention for susceptibility analysis is it's a gateway assessment. It's a screening tool that allows us to identify where might be potentially susceptible to landslides or may be potentially impacted by landslides and where you don't need to worry about. So it's quite important that in that susceptibility analysis, there's a cutoff that says, okay, this is not likely to be, it's flat land miles from slopes. It's not likely to be impacted by landslides. Within the document, we haven't provided, I guess, details on how we would like that susceptibility analysis to be undertaken. That's where we've kind of done the flexibility. So there's none of the geotechnical details of the exact process for undertaking that susceptibility analysis. That would be in other documents, such as the AGS 2007 document. So it can be made as basic as you want it to be or as sophisticated as you want it to be, depending on your resources and the data availability and requirements. And then we move on. This is an example from Thames and the Temps Hospital. And this is a debris flow map looking at the frequency of a 1 in 1,000-year annual exceedance probability event. And this was used to assess the hazard and associated risk to the hospital. It's also worth noting before I hand over to Scott that we've also tried to link all of this the different levels of analysis to the recommendations under the National Adaptation Plan. So the adaptation plan suggests that we use for a screening level assessment, which is equivalent to our level A, or B, we're using an SSP pathway of 8.5, and our more detailed levels analysis, which Scott will talk to in a second, we're using 2 different climate change scenarios. All right, over to you, Scott.
Cool, thanks, Saskia. So moving on to levels C, D, and E, which are our risk analyses. As Saskia said, these are where we start to incorporate the consequences of landslide events. So what is the impact of those events on people, property, land, infrastructure, and so on? And what are the potential costs associated with that too? Level C is obviously our most simple risk analysis that we've got available to us. In this, we kind of set out that we consider the most likely landslide size event along with the maximum credible event. And that kind of gives us the most straightforward basis from which to assess risk. For a level D assessment, we start to increase the number of scenarios that might trigger a landslide event. So that's either rainfall or earthquake induced landslides. And here we definitely consider climate change scenarios as part of that. And as Saskia said before, for this, we connect back to the National Adaptation Plan's recommendations in this regard. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel as to what information should be considered where. We want to use what's already available out there and tailor it to landslides. For our level D assessment, our resolution and the details of analysis and the accuracy or the detail of the underlying data sets are also likely to increase here. And then on the right-hand side there, level E risk analysis is our highest level available to us. And so for this, where we really step up from our level D analysis, is considering the full range of landslide triggering scenarios. So that's both rainfall and earthquake events. The likelihood of these triggering events, we include both the RCP 4 and 8 climate change scenarios, and then the full range of landslide scenarios that could be triggered by these. So we really leave no stone unturned with our level E analysis. So now, to integrate these different levels of analysis that our engineering geologists and geotech specialists are able to undertake with our land use planning processes, we've got 3 decision trees or kind of flow charts that step through these. Our starting point for each of these, though, is an underlying assumption that we have a level A susceptibility analysis that's been undertaken. We consider that everywhere should be able to have a level A susceptibility analysis. And we also consider or recommend that these should be undertaken by regional councils with support and in partnership with territorial authorities. Based on those level A analysis, as Saskia said, we can rule out the areas that don't need further, more detailed assessment. And so this was really key for us in the feedback that we received. We're not recommending that landslide hazard and risk assessment needs to be undertaken everywhere, only where the hazard could occur. So to determine the requirements for further assessment, we aligned the specific zonings in the national planning standards with the levels of assessment based on the type of development that we could anticipate within that zone. As a general rule of thumb, the higher the density of the development, the greater the expectation created by that zoning for development to occur, and the more kind of imminent the potential for development in that zone or in that potential landslide hazard area, the higher the level of analysis we recommend is. We also considered the medium density residential standards, and we treat these similarly to the more development intensive zoning, so our more residential zoned areas. In considering the responsibilities for who should be undertaking these slightly more onerous levels of assessment, we consider that should sit with the person or the authority initiating the plan development process. And we have a table that sets out the information requirements, the outputs from each of these, the underlying uncertainty that still remains with each assessment, the suitable applications for them, so which process we consider they should be best applied to, and the responsibility for undertaking each level of assessment. So now, as we step through resource consent and building consent flow charts, our kind of key consideration for moving through these was that we didn't want to have a more onerous assessment further down the line, where we considered it would maybe best be placed earlier in sort of the overall planning process, to try to line up as best we can the minimum levels of assessment from the plan development process through into the consenting process, because that feedback on kind of where the burden of this assessment sat was really clear, that we didn't want to just kind of kick it further down the line to another person, another process, or another actor. So for resource and subdivision consents, we start with the same underlying assumption that there's a level A susceptibility analysis has been undertaken as a minimum. And then we broadly considered the type of activity for which consent is being sought, and its sensitivity or potential vulnerability to landslides. So some councils are already starting to determine what this means for them in their district plans, or in the process, of introducing such an approach. They include Porirua, Whangarei, Whakatane, Dunedin as well. And at the end of last year, we published a report analysing all of the RMA planning documents in this regard. But kind of in short, the greater the potential sensitivity or the higher the susceptibility, for landslides, the higher the level of analysis we recommend be undertaken as part of that resource or subdivision consent. And then lastly, we consider building consents as well. And so here we have that same starting point of a level A susceptibility analysis having been undertaken, but we use the building importance levels that are defined in the building code to determine our kind of minimum level of recommended analysis. And from the plan development process and the subdivision and resource consents, the step up for building consents comes at the kind of top end of building importance levels. So it's 3, 4, and 5. And this covers buildings like hospitals, public buildings that hold a lot of people like schools and prisons, key infrastructure buildings, buildings that are needed post-hazard, and particularly hazardous facilities as well. And so this is the only point at which we recommend a level D as the minimum level of analysis be undertaken here. And this is only where you would maybe be considering or remotely considering locating one of these buildings in a landslide hazard area, ideally potentially having ruled it out earlier in the process, or ruled out locating a building like this in an area like this from the earlier information. And so to complement the 3 flowcharts and the table that's got all the detailed information, we consolidated all of this into this table here as well, which sets out the overlap between the 3 different planning processes and the levels of assessment. And so the reason for this was that we found that different audiences received information differently. So for those undertaking the assessment, we consider that they would want as much detail on what needs to go in those level A through E assessments. And so there's a table earlier in the diagram or earlier in the document that sets that out for them. Whereas for planners processing consent or developing a plan change, the decision trees might be the best tool for them. And then for those kind of providing overarching advice on this stuff, this diagram here sets it all out concisely. And so this is kind of the most synthesized version of all of that that we've got within the guidance. So moving on to our examples in practice. Saskia, do you want to cover off level A?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to this one and Nelson just previously, but I think maybe it's also worth mentioning that, if you have a more basic approach, you might need to, in your susceptibility, so you're just using some very simple susceptibility metrics and simple run out, you might have to take a more precautionary approach Whereas if you're going to spend more time and more effort doing something maybe more sophisticated perceptibility, you might have a less precautionary approach. Yeah, so that would be what I was going to cover. Scott, back to you for the planning side.
Cool. Yeah, so Nelson's obviously got their susceptibility mapping, but they've also got overlays in their resource management plan, and there's rules connected to this, particularly around the Tahunanui slump, controlling activities around stormwater, earthworks, and residential development. And by and large, they've used this overlay as a trigger for further geotech assessment to support any consent applications on either the Tahunanui slump core or the fringe. Our other examples that we use, we've got a couple of level D examples here. The first one is from Queenstown Lakes District Council. They're in the midst of a process to understand their landslide and debris flow hazard and consequences in Brewery Creek and Reavers Lane. As part of this, they modelled 3 scenarios, or 3 debris flow and rockfall scenarios, and then looked at the potential building damage losses as a result of each of those scenarios. And they're using this information to inform conversations with the community, with council, and ultimately, I think, moving towards potentially a plan change on these fans. Our second case here for level D risk analysis is from Matata in the Bay of Plenty. We're all quite familiar with it for the kind of the managed retreat element of it here. So there was a debris flow event in 2012, but to inform that managed retreat process that Whakatane District Council and Bay of Plenty Regional Council went through, they modelled 4 debris flow scenarios in order to understand what the risk was of future events, and that in order to inform their approach within their management plans or within their planning documents. And then lastly, a couple of level E risk analysis examples. The first one from the Christchurch Replacement District Plan, or the Christchurch District Plan as it is now. So following the Canterbury earthquake sequence, GNS Science did a whole lot of work to understand the landslide, rockfall, and cliff collapse hazards there. A lot of modelling work went into it to understand the annual individual fatality risk. So that's the likelihood of the most at-risk person being killed by one of those events. Overlays were developed in the district plan, and then rules controlling activities in the overlay are also included in there. And then our second example there is from the Kaikoura district plan, where they looked at local personal risk. So that's the assuming that there's going to be a person located there 100% of the time. They've introduced a debris inundation overlay there, and there's rules controlling activities within that overlay within their district plan.